Hello, I'm Anabel González, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And I'm very pleased to welcome you back to TradeWinds, our virtual event series where we discuss the future of global trade and investment in a changing landscape with leading policymakers and experts from across the world. We continue to be in a happy mood, celebrating the first anniversary of TradeWinds. And over the course of this year, we have had some great speakers addressing some of the most important global and regional trade challenges with an audience that now expands across 109 countries. So thanks to all of you in the audience for your continued support. Before we go into today's episode, I would also like to share with you that I am honored and humbled to have been selected by Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the WTO, as one of her 4 deputies, alongside a great group of colleagues: Angela Ellert from the US, Jean-Marie Pogam from France, and Zhang Yang from China. I am very excited about the opportunity to contribute to revitalize the multilateral trading system and hope to continue to engage with many of you in that capacity. This will not mean the end of TradeWinds, so stay tuned for more information to come. Now back to our program today. This is our 8th episode of TradeWinds in 2021, and I am delighted that today we will discuss how to make progress on digital trade negotiations, a topic that is of great importance to help support an inclusive economic recovery. So today we have a special episode of TradeWinds with 2 parts. In the first part, Simon Evenet will present the Digital Policy Alert, a new initiative to map developments implicating digital commerce. In the second part, a panel of experts, including John Denton, Deborah Elms, and Daniel Price, will join Simon and me to discuss how to move forward on digital trade negotiations. So to start, let me go over to our first part, and I am very pleased to introduce Simon Evenet, economics professor at the University of St. Gallen, Switzerland. He is the founder of the St. Gallen Endowment for Prosperity through Trade, the new institutional home of the Global Trade Alert. He has now recently launched the Digital Policy Alert, which is the second pillar of the endowment's activities. Simon's policy engagement and writing focus on making the world trading system more transparent so as to create opportunities for as many people as possible. So welcome back, Simon, and thanks so much for agreeing to present the Digital Policy Alert here at TradeWinds. I will come back to you in a moment. And for all of you in the audience, as usual, please get ready to submit your questions using the Q&A feature in the platform. Once Simon has made his presentation, I will introduce our distinguished panelists. So digital trade was growing fast before COVID-19. Amid lockdowns and restrictions, the pandemic further deepened the shift towards e-commerce. In building back better, digital technologies could help increase productivity, diversify exports, and spur a more broad-based and inclusive recovery. However, we know that a myriad of barriers and impediments, from localization requirements to infringement of intellectual property, to discriminatory standards and licenses, to restrictions on electronic payment systems and more, limit the benefits of e-commerce and continue to proliferate. Some of these measures are also rather subtle or opaque. So initiatives like the Digital Trade Estimates Project at the European Center for International Political Economy, SEP, and the Digital Services Trade Restrictiveness Index of the OECD have brought transparency to digital trade policies, but the scope is limited. The lack of comprehensive accounts of all policies and measures that affect the digital economy, which can be compared across countries, limits the ability of trade policymakers to formulate evidence-based policies and to effectively develop rules to manage the cross-border spillovers of such policies via international trade negotiations. The Digital Policy Alert, a companion to the top transparency initiative that you all know well, Global Trade Alert, aims precisely at addressing this vacuum. It maps policies affecting digital trade in a comparable set of information of the laws, regulations, and associated enforcement related to domestic and cross-border commercial transactions facilitated by digital technologies and to other commercial activities that are underpinned by data. So Simon, again, welcome very much. Welcome to TradeWinds. You and your team have recently launched the Digital Policy Alert. And let us now hear from you on the scope, the distinct features, and its contributions to digital trade policymaking and negotiations. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Anabel, and thank you also to your colleagues at the Peterson Institute for making this special webinar possible. My purpose here is to give you a briefing on the Digital Policy Alert, and to do that I'm going to share some slides. So let me just raise those slides onto the screen, and I hope that you can see them now. And I will move it to, perfect. So what I would like to do in this briefing is to provide you with the motivation for this initiative. In fact, you have already given quite a lot of the motivation for transparency in this area, and then to talk about its implementation and some of its findings. This initiative began in the second quarter of last year with a methodical scoping exercise of the different types of policies that the private sector, government officials, and analysts said were influencing cross-border commerce in this in the digital economy. Having put together a taxonomy, which was then refined with dialogue with experts, we then began to execute our monitoring from the beginning of this year. And on the 15th of April, we went live with the Digital Policy Alert, which you can find on the Global Trade Alert website. If we could just start a little bit of why we need an initiative like this, a historical parallel, I think, really nails it, or at least nailed it for me. That is, when governments got serious about talking about agricultural trade, they realized they didn't have a common lexicon, there was no accepted measures of policy stance, and not much was known about the cross-border harm or benefits created by different policy choices. Fortunately, the OECD Secretariat stepped into that particular breach and has put together a series of tools and a taxonomy, which has been used ever since to shape discussions. In the digital policy area, however, we have no such inventory. And what we want to do is to essentially replicate that particular historical advance. Now, digging deeper, we see three parallel developments which are relevant here. The first is that the digital economy has expanded considerably. You made good mention of the pandemic. Government regulation is trying to catch up with private sector and technological developments, yet that regulatory overdrive is not well informed by, it's simply not informed by a systematic inventory of policy alternatives and alike. And so there is a fear that maybe some of the policies chosen might not be optimal. The second parallel development, and sort of linked to the first, is the demand for quality information here to inform policy deliberation is rising. And we see that demand rising in national debates, in regulatory fora, and here we have the interesting proposal for a potential data and technology forum, which could become a bit like the Financial Stability Board was for the financial sector. We have essentially a proposal on the table for that, and of course that dialogue would need to be supported with quality information as well. We have a number of governments advancing negotiations on e-commerce chapters in regional trading agreements, and we have the JSI talks in Geneva and the work program on e-commerce at the WTO. And so the demand for high quality information is there. Also, the third development I want to highlight is that the risks, I think, are becoming more apparent if we don't get the policy mix right, where we could end up denying opportunities to small and medium-sized enterprises seeking new customers and new suppliers abroad. The customers who could benefit from cross-border supply of services could face limited choices. We have a potential uncertainty over policy regimes and frameworks, and we know that uncertainty chills investment. The potential for conflicting or inconsistent policy will lead potentially to fragmentation of the digital economy, and this compromises business models which are often built on scale. We also have the concerns that innovation in this space, which has been so critical, could be held back by poor policy choice. And even if governments, compounding all of this, this risks are, of course, concerns that policy is not particularly transparent, and this limits accountability as well. So we have essentially a growing demand for high quality information, which needs to be needs to be met, and we have greater downside if we don't get this right. And so the premise that the digital policy alert was based upon was that greater transparency of policy will contribute to better national policy making and more fruitful cooperation. And so the goal that we set out for ourselves was to create an independent inventory of policy that would become the point of reference. And in our scoping exercise, we identified 12 regulatory domains that were important. And what we are doing is to systematically map what governments are doing and to create a database which is highly accessible and sortable. And so that for different users who may have different interests can go onto our website and extract the information they need in real time. We believe it's important that the data collection exercise be independent and impartial, so as to become accepted as the point of reference. Clearly, such information acquisition is a global public good, and it's one which at the moment is missing. How do we propose to do this? Well, as you pointed out, Anabel, for 10 years we have been collecting information on more traditional forms of trade policy, and we want to capitalize on the experience of the Global Trade Alert and adapt it to the complex reality of digital policy making. Now, specifically what we have been doing and what we have done in the Global Trade Alert, and what we propose to do here, is to combine human expertise in the different regulatory domains with machines that systematically surveil developments on relevant government websites. And this generates a stream of leads, which then our analysts then evaluate for potential inclusion in the inventory. When they make such an evaluation, they deploy rigorous protocols for documenting policy and regulatory steps. And these protocols were developed over time in consultation with stakeholders. Our goal ultimately is to create this inventory and then to reflect on the developments that we're observing to formulate thought leadership and help inform different stakeholders of developments going on and provide some sense of perspective. All the way throughout the Global Trade Alert, we have engaged seriously with private sector and public sector stakeholders, and that's exactly what we intend on doing this time around. Let me provide you then with a bit more details on how we're going to do this, or rather how we have been doing this since the beginning of the year. So the first thing is we have conceived of this project as having 3 stages, each associated with a mountain. And the first stage is what we call Project Matterhorn. And in Project Matterhorn, what we would be doing is mapping all of the policies found in prior mapping exercises, plus others that we found that were important. And we're going to make that mapping available on the Global Trade Alert website. Specifically, in the first phase, we've prepared an early warning system, and the goal here is to be able to provide information on policy developments as they occur, as they relate to the digital economy. And so just to highlight here, just to recall here, many policies and regulations evolve over time. They get proposed, then there's a consultation period, then there are revisions before final enactment. Our goal in this particular initiative is to track each step of those policy developments or regulatory developments. And so what we do is track what we call events associated with different policy and regulatory developments. So what I can highlight is, what I can report here now is that this mapping or early warning system was launched on the 15th of April of this year. And this year alone, we have found 215 events which relate to 168 separate regulatory and policy changes. And then just to give you a sense of how this database is growing, when we launched it on the 15th of April, it had 437 regulatory events in it. Now it has 566. So in the 19 days since we've launched, we've added 129 events to this register, and you can see that this this database is growing fast, and we hope that its utility will grow with it. Furthermore, this year we are seeing about 45 to 70 different regulatory events occurring in per month, and this is in the countries covered, which are the G20 countries and the EU members. Our goal ultimately down the road will be to expand the country coverage. What I would submit to you is that this rather extensive evidence collection exercise probably goes beyond that which many governments and many companies are willing to invest in. And so what we have here is hopefully a central repository which will save a lot of resources in evidence collection elsewhere. In terms of actual developments that we found this year, perhaps I just highlight 5 quickly. What's become very clear is the intensified regulatory scrutiny of the big tech companies. The second area where we've seen a lot of action is, of course, regulatory initiatives with respect to infrastructure, in particular, the exclusion of certain companies from national 5G infrastructures. A third area where we have seen a lot of action is in data protection and data transfers. 170 of the regulatory developments on our website relate to this very important area, which we're seeing a lot of action in. A fourth area where we're seeing a lot of action is in content regulation. 98 of the regulatory developments that we've seen relate to this particular area of policy. And the last area where we're beginning to see some very interesting developments is in AI strategies, or strategies towards emerging technologies, with significant policy developments in the EU, Brazil, China, Indonesia, and Germany. And so this gives you a sense of the type of information that we are already beginning to glean over time. I checked this morning, we have 566 different regulatory events which have been documented on our website. And what we have on the left-hand side is a clip from the a screenshot from the website, and what you can see, what I've just pulled up here is an example from Australia of the type of rich information that we are cataloging for each particular regulation which is underway. So our first product then is an early warning system which has already been launched. This will be complemented by a second product which we will roll out in the fall of this year, and that is that for the G20 countries, we will take these regulatory interventions and then map them out in a detailed way using a very explicit taxonomy, and that taxonomy will highlight different features of the regulation, and those attributes could include whether foreign firms and domestic firms are treated in an even-handed manner, the extent to which policy is transparent or not, the extent to which there are departures from international best practice, and also the extent to which policy was formulated in a way that the private sector could engage. And we are considering other attributes too. And the goal is to generate an information base which can be searched along lots of different dimensions, maybe by country, by sector, by theme. A theme could be artificial intelligence, and by attribute. And so the goal then is ultimately to have a series of mappings which will help decision makers to inform themselves very quickly. So that's what we have done and where we are going. Let me just quickly conclude by saying what are the potential uses of such an inventory like this. I think there are 6. The first is that the early warning systems can support dialogue with rule makers before decisions are finalized. And this this provides opportunity for experts and private sector companies and their experts to be able to engage with the governments. Secondly, such an inventory can help spot emergent trends, which can be important, especially in regulatory fora where governments are trying to get a sense about where policy is going. Thirdly, of course, within nations, there is a policy deliberation and formation processes, and this could be informed by high quality information. Development of international best practices is another area where trusted inventories can make a contribution. The transparency generated by an inventory will also help build confidence, which is a prerequisite for cooperation and coordination. And also the high quality inputs that we wish to provide are ones which can feed into fora and deliberative organizations, and to also help trade negotiators to better advance their objectives in the area of digital trade. So these are 6 areas where we see our an inventory contributing, and this is ultimately what we wish to accomplish. Let me just conclude by saying that this is a project which has been undertaken with my colleagues at the St. Gallen Endowment. My colleague Johannes Fritz is very heavily involved with this initiative, and he and I would be very happy to speak with anyone interested in this project afterwards. We're very serious about engagement, and we would love to continue the dialogue with interested counterparties. Thank you very much, Anabel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon, for presenting this very interesting tool. I have a question for you, but before going there, Alan Deert, professor of economics at Michigan University, he has a question, which is that, on a technical point, if a policy is first reported as being considered and later as enacted, is that one event or 2 events?
So thank you, Anabel, and thank you to Alan, my former colleague in Michigan. That would be 2 events. So I think what we would distinguish between is the policy or regulatory intervention itself and stages along the process. So there could be more than one stage, and each reported stage is an event. I hope that clarifies this matter.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. We also have another technical question from Hildegard Kivik-Nortas, who says, in this area, reasonable people may disagree on what is best practice. So could you elaborate a bit on how you plan to establish the standards against which policies will be benchmarked against?
Thank you for that. This is a great question from Hildegard. There are, as you know, a number of best practices, or at least agreed practices amongst countries, which one could benchmark against. There are OECD guidelines, there are APEC guidelines, there are G20 guidelines as well. They differ in their level of specificity, but what I think we would try and do, and what we have done where necessary in the Global Trade Alert, is to look for ways in which one could factually assess whether or not there is a departure or an omission, and that's often the case, quite important here. Is a policy incomplete, or an area has not been addressed by a particular policy, and whether that departs from accepted best practice. I think the important point here is not to fixate on thinking there is a single best practice. Maybe it's better to think of best practices and to benchmark against different best practices, and when we let the users decide which of the different filters they find most compelling.
Thank you, Simon. Another important question from Daniel Ranghill, who says, what are the criteria to be applied to determine whether a measure is discriminatory or not? Even in existing bilateral trade agreements, there are different definitions of this.
That's absolutely correct. So I think the practice we have always adopted in the Global Trade Alert is to look for de jure discrimination. We recognize that de facto discrimination is possible. So that's one split. We tend to go look more for de jure discrimination. If there is, of course, evidence after the fact that there has been de facto discrimination, then we would certainly consider that. And then, of course, within this particular issue, as has been highlighted by others, analysts, there is a question as to whether you look at discrimination against a class of foreign companies or any particular foreign company. And there's an important distinction in trade agreements between non-discrimination principles, which apply to all to a class of digital products or to any particular digital provider. And again, I think we will have a fine-grained assessment of discrimination, so that whichever of those 2 viewpoints you take, you can extract the information you need.
Thank you. Thanks, Simon. So I had one question before going to our panel, and I'm also getting a similar question here from Bozkurt Aran, which is based on the early warning system for policy changes by G20 members that you recently launched. What is your initial assessment of the digital trade barriers landscape out there?
Okay, let me just step back. I try and avoid the phrase digital trade barriers, not because I don't think that they exist. It's just that as the questions have shown, there's a lot of disagreement about what constitutes a barrier. I think instead, if you were to ask me the question, what are we seeing in terms of changes in the digital policy space. I mean, this is a very fast-changing domain. And I highlighted the 5 areas where we've already seen action this year, which are important in my talk. And so I think the issue here is more the intensification of policymaking, and the very fact that I think a lot of that policymaking is not necessarily being informed by very systematic comparisons of different policy options. And one fears that the cross-border spillovers and risks created are not getting the attention that they deserve. And so given such an uptick in regulatory policymaking that we've seen both this year and last year, the broader picture is one of concerns about potential incoherence, concerns that fragmentation may result, all of the fears that we mentioned earlier. Now, I do not want to sort of make a broad brush accusation about all policies moving in the wrong direction, but one does get the sense that this is an area which could really do with a bit more transparency and a lot more open information about what governments are doing, so that governments themselves can make more informed decisions.
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully that is exactly what the Digital Policy Alert will do. So thank you very much, Simon, for presenting it here at TradeWinds. And let me now move to the second part of our episode today, which is how to move forward on digital trade negotiations. And let me start by introducing our panel. So first, I am delighted to have with us John Denton, Secretary General at the International Chamber of Commerce. John is a global business leader, an international advisor on policy, and a legal expert on international trade and investment. He's also a board member of the UN Global Compact and co-chair of the B20 Finance and Infrastructure Task Force, as well as a founding member of the Business 20, the B20, the Australia-China CEO Roundtable, and UNHCR in Australia. Mr. Denton serves on the board of leading global infrastructure group IFM Investors, and I am very pleased to welcome him back to TradeWinds. I'm also very pleased to be that we're joined by Dr. Deborah Elms, founder and executive director of the Asian Trade Center. The Asian Trade Center works with governments and companies to design better trade policies for the region. Debbie is president of the Asia Business Trade Forum Association, and she served on the Trade and Investment Council of the World Economic Forum from 2017 to 2019, with me, actually. She's also served on the International Technical Advisory Committee of the Global Trade Professionals Alliance, and was chair of the Working Group on Trade Policy and Law. She was also a senior fellow in the Singapore Ministry of Trade, Trade and Industries, Trade Academy, and also headed its trade negotiations, the Temasek Foundation Center for Trade Negotiations. She was also senior fellow of International Political Economy at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Debbie publishes the Talking Trade blog, which I highly recommend. And I'm also very glad to welcome Daniel Price, co-founder and managing director at Rock Creek Global Advisors, an international economic policy advisory firm that works with global companies on trade, investment, technology, national security, climate change, and regulatory matters. Previously, Dan served as the principal international economic advisor to President George W. Bush. He chaired various dialogues with the EU, Japan, India, and Brazil, served as Sherpa for the G8, APEC, and North America Leaders Summit, and organized the first G20 Leaders Summit. Earlier, he chaired Sidley Austin's International Trade and Dispute Resolution Group, served as Deputy General Counsel at USTR, and also at the State Department. So welcome to all of you. I am delighted that you are here with us at TradeWinds. So let me say just a few remarks to frame our discussion. We know that in recent years, countries have engaged in increased trade cooperation to develop common rules to govern cross-border e-commerce in goods and services. At the preferential level, about half of WTO members have agreed to rules on the topic. 182 preferential trade agreements include provisions on digital trade. 107 of them cover specific e-commerce provisions, and 77 have dedicated e-commerce chapters. Some of the most recent agreements with digital commerce chapters includes the USMCA, the US-Japan Digital Trade Agreement, the CPTPP, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement between Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore, the UK-Japan FTA, and the Regional Economic Partnership Agreement, RCEP. The scope and depth of these agreements are very different. And while some of them pave the way with new and innovative provisions, it is also the case that such a proliferation of deals results in a patchwork of rules governing digital trade around the world. At the multilateral level, some 86 WTO members, accounting for more than 90% of global trade and representing all major geographic regions and development levels, are engaged in negotiations of an agreement on e-commerce. They are focusing on 6 themes: enabling e-commerce, openness and e-commerce, trust and e-commerce, market access, telecommunications, and cross-cutting issues. Participating countries just recently agreed to the first clean article in the draft negotiating text on the issue of spam, and other 10 clean articles are expected by the summer break. Big strides are still needed, however, to make significant progress. So let me turn now to our panelists, in particular to John, Debbie, and Dan, and we will bring Simon later on as well. In your view, how to make progress on digital trade negotiations? What are the key topics that should be covered in these negotiations? And maybe let me start with you, John, and welcome back to TradeWinds.
Look, thanks very much, Anabel, and heartfelt congratulations on your appointment. And as I said to you as we were coming in, Dr. Ngozi is building a formidable team, but she needs it. There's a lot of work to be done, and I look forward to actively engaging in support of a WTO, the building the WTO of the future with people like you, Anabel. And thanks very much for having me along today. And what a great panel you have. And it's an honor to be with Dan and with Deborah as well. And by the way, with what Simon's doing, we're fully supportive of this. Actually, we do think more information and timely information is necessary. And we see this ourselves. I mean, some of you on the line will know that the ICC represents 45 million businesses globally. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, we pivoted the organization to actually be not only a global position, but to take a regional position and actually really work on local impacts. We established regional action networks in Africa, in the Arab world, in Latin America, and most recently in the Caribbean. I asked especially to do so in Asia, etc. We poll them on what they want us to talk about at our regional action networks. And then that we bring together the many national committees of the ICC, for example, in Africa, and effectively almost all the chambers of commerce in Africa. We bring them all together. So this is a huge group. What do they want to talk about? They want to talk about, number one issue is digital, and that goes across all the regional action networks. There's different aspects to it, there's no doubt about that, but curiously, policy irregularities and policy infelicities and the lack of policy coherence is actually a key issue amongst SMEs in African economies. This comes up when we actually deep dive and do webinars, because we're creating centers of entrepreneurship, for example, in Ghana, in Nigeria, in South Africa, etc. And where we go into the SME, we do webinars with them and bring in 200, 300 SMEs and actually workshop what the issues are. One of the key issues there is actually policy incoherence around digital policy making in a number of African economies. But looking at the context in which we are now in terms of, I think, the digital discussions and the JSI discussions, it's very different to when it started. The first thing to note is that COVID-19 has upended the normal course of business activity across the global real economy. And we fought very hard to ensure this was understood at global level as a real economy crisis, not a financial services crisis. That was where it was initially positioned by a number of the leaders and policy advisors. We actually pushed for this to be seen for what it is, a crisis of the real economy, and that's SMEs and micro SMEs. And it's interesting for us that the economic impact of COVID-19 has been enormous. I think we all know that, and particularly acute in some sectors. And clearly with lockdowns and social distancing, etc., we're seeing the inability to move things around. Right now in India, for example, we at the ICC are involved with our brothers and sisters there in actually not just trying to get more oxygen and actually remove export barriers, by the way, on fundamental therapeutics which are needed to actually treat COVID-19, but actually reigniting the digital discussion. because with the lockdowns, to actually keep mobility moving, we need to have digital recognition. We also need to have the recognition of digital documentation for transactions. We don't want people simply dying. We don't want to deprive them of their livelihood at the same time. It's actually quite a challenge there, because we need to actually reignite the policy interest in actual moving and recognition of digital documentation as well. But what we have noticed during this whole process has been that the digital world, e-commerce, has actually been the lifeblood of many communities throughout the COVID-19 crisis, particularly as economies and societies and communities sought to flatten the curve. Contactless payments, we know, became critical, enable safe, COVID-free transactions, and we want to see more of that. That's the piece we're pushing on in India right now. Brick and mortar retailers rapidly moved to sell their wares online, powered by these extraordinary ecosystems that have emerged. The power and the creativity of the private sector really is a wonder to behold. And citizens use social media to maintain connection with friends, always relying upon access to the digital platform. And e-commerce marketplaces provided consumers with safety, choice, and convenience. And it is amazing how transport and logistic companies were able to convert themselves, contort themselves, and re-coordinate and repurpose themselves to ensure that goods that were ordered online were delivered. It's actually amazing to think about how that was actually enabled on a global basis. So the way we see it in the post-pandemic recovery, though in some cases there's only the whisper of that, and others there's really just the weeds we're looking at. But as we start seeing potential green shoots of recovery, we think the digital economy is going to have an even more critical role to play in ensuring a rapid post-pandemic and resilient recovery. However, the ability of the digital economy and digitally enabled trade to assist in the global economic recovery, promote inclusive economic growth, and ensure resilience in the face of future crises to a large extent hinges on a high standard, which is what we want to see, a high standard agreement on the trade-related aspects of e-commerce. For us, the e-commerce JSI is critical. As you say, the current participants account for well over 90% of world trade volume, so it's an incredibly impressive list. And when we first started arguing for this, it was actually a very small group, and it was pretty well divided. Now to see the number of countries that have joined into this discussion is very significant, and I think it's a very impressive, recognition of the importance of the digital economy in the 21st century. But recognition is not enough. We want action. And global business continues to support processes, and a process that will result in a high standard outcome. We need an agreement on the policy settings that will drive innovation and enable that and power the economic recovery. For ICC, what we want to see when we talk about a high quality outcome is five core issues covered. The first is around market access and connectivity. The second is around cross-border data transfers. The third is around trade facilitation. The fourth is around trust and security. And the fifth is capacity building. Let me just unpack those a little bit. When we're talking about cross-border, about market access and connectivity, we want common rules to ensure open, non-discriminatory access to digital and digitally enabled markets that support competition. When we talk about cross-border data transfers, we want to see a requirement not to impose the localization of data, including for storage or processing. And I'll come back to why that's an issue, particularly for SMEs, particularly in emerging economies. Thirdly, trade facilitation. New disciplines building on the WTO trade facilitation agreement, the so-called TFA plus disciplines that can simplify the processing of low-value shipments, create a commercially meaningful de minimis threshold for low-value, low-risk goods, and an informal clearance regime for goods valued above de minimis but below formal clearance. We're talking about trust and security. We want commitments on cross-border consumer protection standards, data protection standards, absolutely critical, and dispute settlement to strengthen consumer trust. And capacity building. Alongside the e-commerce JSI disciplines, I think it's actually important to understand that we really need to ensure that with the leaders of the JSI, the leaders of this area, they actually make certain that we include a development focus in the progress, to actually have a substantive progress on the JSI discussions. We want to see that, and we want to see significant scaling up and enhancing of coordination of existing trade-related capacity building programs. We are doing a lot at the ICC from a private sector point of view with our centers of entrepreneurships across the world, our commitment to digitize more than 5 million SMEs in the African continent alone. But more needs to be done, and we want to see the private sector also marshal its share of the opportunity to build capacity, but also build political commitment to progress in developing countries on a global agreement of this nature. But if I could hone in on one development that we see as critical, which isn't often talked about but needs to be, business needs to see the creation of an enabling legal environment for the digitization of negotiable instruments. To put this into context, while e-commerce in the USA saw user growth of around 40% last year as a result of social distancing and lockdown measures, more than 99% of bills of lading, essential negotiable instruments used to finance trade, remained in paper format. Think of that. 99% remain in paper format. Global merchandise trade seems to be the one area of the global economy immune to the rapid digitization affected by the pandemic. But this is one type of immunity that we cannot afford to have as a long-lasting immunity. A key reason for this lack of digitization lies in the outdated legal requirement that negotiable instruments be presented in hard copy paper form. The very inertia I was talking about in India at the moment, which we thought we'd actually push back against, but once they declared victory, that inertia came back in, and we actually have resorted to the requirement to actually have wet signatures on documents, which is impossible to do in the current environment, and as you know, is increasingly difficult to do, and is actually continually difficult to do in many economies where you still have lockdowns or social distancing. So yes, we have a solution. We actually have a solution to this in the form of the UNCITRAL modern law on electronic transferable records, better known as the MLETR. This law is designed to work with all legal systems, was developed through a deliberative and inclusive process, and is technologically neutral, ensuring that provided the core features of negotiable instruments are retained, any technology can be used to digitize them, be it blockchain technology or some future innovation not yet developed. There's been a flurry of activity with respect to the MLETR. One of the projects I set myself and set the ICC was to take this pure work and actually make it applied science, or make it an applied law. So we're working very hard through our digital standards initiative in Singapore to actually create momentum around the adoption of the MLTR as this kind of legal context in which we can actually move to transfer the trading world from analog to digital with confidence and with a legally enforceable framework. And just last week, the G7 digital and technology ministers, and this is something we're pushing very hard on through our various ICCs and the G7s, agreed to a framework to achieve domestic legal reforms. And we like this, championing the work of UNCITRAL and promoting the adoption of legal frameworks compatible with the MLTR. Now, I've got to tell you, we celebrate this. It's the first step. It took a long time to get people focused on it, but we think this is an important step forward to actually have the MLETR recognized at the G7 level. Our job now is to take this to the G20. Our job now is taking this regional. Our job now is going nation by nation and ensuring that countries are aware of this, but also showing them how to do it. So we think there is an important opportunity to include an article in the e-commerce JSI that calls on states to adopt legal frameworks compatible with the MLETR. This is a major gap in the e-commerce chapters of the mega regionals in the RCEP and CPTPP, and only a couple of digital economy agreements advanced by Singapore contain provisions that touch on this important issue. So that's what we want to see. And as I said, I want to hone in that last point. We want to see this legally enabling framework put in place as well. I look forward to coming back during Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John, for your remarks. It's really appalling to think that 99% of the paperwork related to trade transactions continues to be paper. It's absolutely appalling in this age. So we'll probably discuss more about that. Let me now move to Debbie and ask you, Debbie, in your perspective, how to make progress in digital trade negotiations, and most importantly, what should be the content of this negotiations in your view? Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. It's an honor to be here. It's a little stressful, frankly, to follow both Simon and John because they have so much to say that, you know, it's always hard to say what are you going to do to follow this. So I thought what I would do when I talk about trade negotiations is talk about how actually vital this initiative is that Simon is undertaking. And the reason that it's so vital is that we have governments who are enthusiastically signing on to lots of digital provisions, and they are enthusiastically regulating the digital economy in one way or another. And the challenge is that I think this is true elsewhere. Many governments have no idea what they're up to. I mean, literally. So I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, and I apologize to any ASEAN officials who are listening, but we've been engaged in this project where we are helping ASEAN implement an e-commerce agreement that it's already signed. Okay, so the first part of that is an exhaustive mapping study. So I have much sympathy for Simon and his team and their mapping as well. This mapping is not a small problem. You have to spend hours and hours and hours trying to match up the existing legal requirements with the conditions underneath the trade agreement and figure out whether or not those conditions have been met. Then you need to have bilateral consultations. And what's been fascinating to me about this process, especially, is that the bilateral consultations require governments to show up with a huge range of ministries. So it's not just the trade ministry or customs, it's trade plus customs plus the agriculture ministry to think about issues related to sanitary and phytosanitary issues. It's the intellectual property rights office who may need to be there because the agreement may have something to do with IP. And so we have to track IP laws. And so across this, you end up with, depending on the government, 40 or 50 different people representing, a dozen or 24 different agencies and ministries, all of whom have something to say about the digital economy, because the digital economy is increasingly the economy or is related to the economy. And so in order for you to map what appears to be a fairly straightforward document, it turns out to be incredibly complicated. And I think it would be very helpful for all of us if we had Simon's initiative as it goes global, doing that for us, so that you then are not spending all of your time trying to dig in the weeds and figure out whether or not this law exists, when was it passed, when was it approved, do you have the title of the thing correct, have you explained what it is appropriately, is there something you're missing, was there an update that came out that's not in English that you can't find or that never got loaded or whatever. It takes an enormous amount of time. And rather than mapping what you're currently doing, it would be great to be able to spend time talking about, well, how do we move forward? How do we implement new changes? How do we think about new regulatory challenges? And crucially as well, how do we know what we are doing in our government? And how do we know what our neighbors are up to in their different policies? Because one of the real risks, and I think Simon mentioned this, and I think it's not a small problem, is regulatory divergence or regulatory inconsistency. And because the digital economy and the rules that govern digital are so increasingly relevant to most aspects of our lives as citizens and as businesses, you need to have some consistency in these policies. But if you don't even know what your own government has done, then how in the world would you know whether you're consistent or inconsistent in your own internal policies, let alone map that against anyone else's policies, and then make sure that we're all sort of headed in the same, we don't have to go in exactly the same road, but we need to go in the same general direction. And so what does that look like? And I think what's striking, there are many things that are striking, but another thing that is striking is that here we have in ASEAN, 10 countries who are all lined up to go in the same general direction. And even that is difficult. So these are countries that said, yes, we're excited about this. We've signed off on this agreement, leaders endorsement, et cetera. And corralling everyone to move in that general direction is a challenge. So then you think about, how do you do this across other regions? How do you do it at the WTO? I think this is really one of the stories of our time. And if we can't get that regulatory consistency, or at least some understanding of what inconsistency means, then we have real problems making policy. And so I think first step, and my hat's off again to Simon and then the forerunner work of this at the ECIPE in Brussels, to identify what are those regulatory issues that need to be tracked, and then think hard about what are those elements, start building this database so that we can start analyzing it. Because then once you had that base, it would be so much easier to do some of these digital negotiations, because then you would know what is it that your own government is up to, and what are the other people sitting in on this negotiation doing as well in that space. That makes it much easier for you to map gaps rather than map the entire ecosystem of policies. You're just mapping things like, we want to do a rule on payments. We know that cross-border payments is a real challenge. In order for us to get the digital economy working in a regional or global way, we have to deal with this cross-border payments problem. We would be able to quickly say, what is your rule? What are your regulations? What does your legal landscape look like for managing cross-border payments? Does it match up with mine? And if not, then we don't have to have a clause in a trade agreement that says we should cooperate. You could actually say, well, how are we going to cooperate? What are we going to say when we get together to cooperate? Is this a problem that's going to take a few meetings and then it's resolved? Is this a problem that's going to take a 5-year work plan to resolve? But you have some basis for a conversation. Now, what's been happening between many governments is that we have very broad kinds of objectives, lots, especially here in Asia, lots of cooperation commitments. We will cooperate on payments. We will cooperate on digital trade facilitation. We will cooperate on all kinds of elements that turn out to be the crucial issues for business, because business, unfortunately for trade people, business does not want to know what government is going to do 10 years from now, especially in the digital space. Business wants to know, what are you going to do for me tomorrow, or certainly by next quarter? They're not interested in a 10-year roadmap to cooperate on something that is vitally important. And so I think first step, get this database up, make sure that everybody starts feeding information into it, because I think if that is accurate and up to date, that solves a lot of our problems right there. And then we can build on that and say, well, what is it we're trying to accomplish? What is the basis on which we are operating in various kinds of settings, whether it's a regional agreement, whether it's the WTO, whether it's a bilateral, whether we're upgrading an agreement for an old e-commerce chapter that's now being enhanced. We're doing a digital only agreement, something like DEPA, something like the DEAs, the digital economy agreements with Singapore, Australia, a new one coming with Korea, another one coming with the UK. These are the kinds of elements where then you could say, okay, we have the common baseline. We have existing models that we might or might not choose to use. They make sense to us given our current framework, our current landscape, and our current regulatory ecosystem, or they don't. And then we come up with something new. So I think, again, let me just summarize, bottom line, crucial to have the information before you can move ahead with this regulatory harmonization, alignment, cooperation. So we're all consistently moving in the same general direction and avoiding the risk of having a complete mess as everyone regulates in different ways with different objectives without even realizing what somebody else, even in their own government, may or may not have done. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Debbie. I have to say that as a former negotiator myself, your very pragmatic remarks resonate very well with me because it's really very challenging to enter into negotiations without having concrete evidence about the impact of some of this policy. So thank you very much. Let me now turn it over to you, Dan, to listen your views on this topic, and welcome.
Thank you very much, and let me add my congratulations, Anabel, on your new appointment. Many challenges ahead of you. Let me also congratulate Simon on this new initiative, which is very welcome. I'd like to address two what I think of as interrelated points. And I want to pick up with what Debbie said about needing a horizontal look. I think negotiating a digital trade agreement, either broadly, multilaterally, or regionally, with the latter of which would be my preference, I'll come back to that in a moment, is important. But I do think there's another critical element here, and that is the need for what I have called a data and technology forum to strengthen international coordination and cooperation on digital governance and the digital economy generally. I've called this an FSB for tech. What the financial crisis revealed was the absence of good cross-border coordination mechanisms in assessing risk and trying to reach fundamental agreement on key principles. Why wait for a digital crisis to borrow that architecture, which has stood us in such good stead since the global financial crisis? So like the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, a data and technology forum would provide a channel for coordination across the range of digital and technology related governance issues, and where possible, mitigate incongruent, or conflicting measures. The idea would be to try to promote consensus on policy principles, regulatory approaches, standards, cooperative arrangements, and taxonomies. Now, like the FSB, the Data and Technology Forum would not be a supranational regulator. It would be a discussion forum, a forum where the various officials responsible for chunks of the digital economy got together to discuss and try to work out differences. But where there was agreement on principle and national governments did faithfully implement those principles in congruent ways, it would facilitate that degree of trust, which would permit cross-border market access through, for example, mutual recognition or regulatory deference decisions. And to ensure trust in the system, the forum could explore the utility of independent verification or certification mechanisms, as well as peer review processes to check implementation. And again, like the FSB, the Data and Technology Forum would work with existing standard setting bodies. It would not replace them, it would not duplicate, and it would not Bigfoot things that are already working, but would serve as a global forum for addressing these issues. A number of G7 headquartered companies, about 25 in number, have gotten behind this idea and have suggested that the present G7 launch this idea at the leaders meeting in June. The UK hosted G7 already has embraced the notion of something called a future tech forum. What these G7 headquartered companies are suggesting is we take it a step further beyond merely a broad-based multi-stakeholder discussion forum and have a real government-to-government forum, informed, of course, through adequate consultation with the private sector. Okay, so that's at the global horizontal level. And of course, the work that Simon is doing would be critical to providing the empirical basis for example, promoting interoperable privacy regimes, enabling cross-border data flows, and fostering trusted digital infrastructure. Now, what would a trade agreement look like? As John has said, as Debbie has said, and Anabel, as you have said in your opening remarks, what COVID-19 showed was an increased dependence on digital technologies. Many essential industries that kept US workers employed in the crisis, such as logistics and healthcare, are particularly reliant on global technologies and data sets. And middle income jobs are growing in the services, manufacturing, and other sectors that are capitalizing on digital trade and technology. And SMEs in particular are reliant on e-commerce to reach foreign markets and foreign suppliers. I think it would be useful for the United States to get on the front foot on trade and initiate the negotiation of a digital trade agreement with key Asian allies and partners. It would be a strong vehicle for promoting international cooperation and coordination on digital governance. And it would also strengthen US partnerships to advance democratic values and serve as a concrete demonstration of US engagement in the Asia Pacific. We've heard a lot from the administration about rebuilding alliances and wanting to work with allies. That is all very welcome. And the change from the last administration could not be more stark. And again, that is welcome. But it is also time to put meat on the bones. And one of the first steps, one of the first opportunities, it seems to me, to do that would be to launch a regional digital trade agreement with our friends and allies in Asia. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dan. You've touched on a number of very important issues. Let me bring in a quick question from our audience, and I'll pose it to you, Dan, which is from Lisa DiCaprio. She says, one issue that I have faced when advocating digital policies is that it is often unclear which regulator in any given country is the correct point person. So how to go about that, as she says. And I think this goes about your initial point about cross-border coordination with the idea of the Data and Tech Forum, but also at the domestic level, where it's always very challenging to know who's actually in charge of this digital policies.
That's an excellent question. I mean, to borrow an old phrase, when I want to call who's in charge of digital, who do I call? Well, there is no one person in most countries. And that is precisely an argument in favor of this data and technology board. Now, the digital ecosystem is much more complicated and broader than the financial ecosystem. But again, the Financial Stability Board coordinates the work of central bankers, finance ministers, market regulators, bank regulators, et cetera. And just as the need for a country in a leader-led forum to develop an internal domestic policy on an issue forces consultation among agencies to develop that international position, so too a data and technology forum would bring, I think, greater coherence within national governments as they prepared for engagement in this forum. But to pick up again on Debbie's point, because the digital ecosystem touches so many different aspects of the regulatory space, we've got to make sure we've got the right folks at the table. And it may not, you might not have the same people for cybersecurity as you do for privacy. You might not have the same people for AI as on cross-border payments, right? But you do need a forum accountable to leaders where principles can be agreed and decisions can be taken.
Thank you very much, Dan. So both Dan and Debbie and John, you've all mentioned the importance of SMEs. So I'd like maybe to ask you, John, a quick question. How I know that ICC works with SMEs across the world. So how are the small and medium-sized enterprises impacted by these different types of regulations in the digital space?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a great question, Anabel. Look, the unfortunate truth is that when you create trade barriers, be they tariff or non-tariff barriers, it's the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises that suffer the most. For many, new trade barriers could make the difference between entering a foreign market or not, accessing a service to scale a business or not. Two disciplines in particular on data are critical, I think, to ensuring that small businesses can take full advantage of digital technologies and digitally enabled markets. The first is a bit of a hoary old chestnut, frankly, but it's one that I was unaware of until I became more involved in the issue of what it plays out with SMEs. There's this prohibition on customs duties on electronic transmissions. The moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions has enabled digital trade to flourish, preventing the creation of trade barriers and burdensome customs duties or tariffs. It's helped consumers access new products and services and enable businesses, in particular, MSMEs, to access new markets. It's also made a very powerful statement. The default position with new forms of trade arising after the conclusion of the WTO agreement is with no tariffs. As a result, digital trade has been an immense economic driver, enhancing productivity, and we know the rest. But every 2 years, the moratorium is put to the test, and the same tired debate must be had. And I know this because I personally engaged in hand-to-hand combat on this, frankly, with the Indian Minister for Commerce, and on I can go. where the actual maintenance of the moratorium was used as a bargaining chip, failing to understand the importance and the damage that could be caused to SMEs and micro SMEs in developing countries in particular with the removal of that moratorium. Tying it back to the, so something as critical to the development of the internet and digital trade must be made permanent, as the argument we make. And tying it back to the e-commerce JSI and the use of the words high standards outcome, from our point of view, is interrelated with this issue of the maintenance, making it permanent, the moratorium. The second discipline relates to data localization requirements. And I know in the chat, this is something that's not agreed with or not a common view across the participants in this discussion. Globally, half of all services trade depends on access to cross-border data flows. Data localization requirements can mean the need to have a local presence or maintain local content, both requirements that raise costs for small businesses to a level that can deter entry to new markets and reduce opportunities to participate in global value chains. It's worth recalling that SMEs employ between 60 to 90% of the workforce, yet account for only 1% of global exports, with only 28% selling beyond their borders. We want to enable that to happen. And we also don't fully understand yet, though our hypothesis is the percentage of global foreign direct investment that is as a consequence of SME activity is much larger than people understand, and it results in real jobs. So it's really important to think about this. Data we've seen shows that the vast majority of technology-enabled small firms export, 90% on average, and as much as 100% in some countries. So it's well worth thinking through this issue of data localization and its impact, which we find as negative on SMEs and micro SMEs, and inhibits exports as a consequence and their growth.
Thank you, John. I know, David, that you also work with SMEs, particularly in Asia, and we've seen recently that the adoption of a number of policy and regulatory actions in that part of the world, be it on cybersecurity concerns related to online content, broadcast or advertising rules in the form of digital services taxes, and others that could actually limit the potential of digital trade and the development of the digital economy. So what is going on in the region, and what can be done about it?
Well, I think that, as John just mentioned, if we don't make trade work for small businesses, then it doesn't work for most people, since most people are employed by small businesses. So how do you make trade work better for small businesses? You need to make it easier. You need to make it simpler. You need to make it less complicated. And every time that you create some new obstacle to doing business, it becomes impossible for small businesses. So let me just give you an example. I'm harping on payments because we just finished this work on payments, and we did a lot of interviews of our small businesses across the 29 markets in the region to ask them about how do they get paid? How do they get paid, and how do they buy from their suppliers? So that cross-border payment question. And it turns out that nearly all of the small businesses we contacted use bank transfers or wire transfers for payment. Why? Because it works. It's not the most efficient, it's expensive, it's time consuming, but it works for them. And so that's what they do. That's what they use. Well, by default, I mean, there's so many challenges with that, right? You're now not able to sell to consumers. You're in the business to business markets and not B2C, which is now thriving under COVID because you can't handle the payments part. Why can't you handle the payments part? Well, we often have interoperable systems that are not interoperable across borders. It's too difficult. Yes, there's some fintech solutions, but they're not very commonly understood or widely distributed across the region. Many of the companies don't know about it. Many of their customers have never heard of these things and don't trust them. And so we end up with this payment system that stops small businesses from engaging in cross-border trade. I think this is a huge loss. It's a huge missed opportunity because for many businesses, they have products or services that could be extremely valuable in other markets, but they can't participate in overseas trade because they can't manage payments. The same thing is true across the board. If we had this customs duties on electronic transmissions, it would kill most small businesses. I mean, they don't even know what a duty is. Most of them are services providers. They would say, I have to pay a tariff. I don't even know what that is. And I have to get paperwork for it. And I have to be exempted from it. I mean, this is a nightmare. One that is coming up, which I'll just mention briefly before I stop, that's going to be deeply problematic for small businesses is on taxation. Cross-border taxes, especially cross-border digital services taxes, is going to be an absolute nightmare for small businesses. They will have to remit taxes to multiple jurisdictions. They will have to be registered on platforms or their financial services companies or their logistics providers to collect those taxes on their behalf. They will have to be paid in different jurisdictions. They'll have to be figured out some way to get them back to them if they don't hit a threshold, if there's a threshold in place. I mean, the complications for taxes for small businesses in the digital space is epic. So I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't regulate. Let me just be clear. You can regulate, you can tax, but you need to be very careful about what you're doing and how the impact will be felt by the smaller companies in your economy, because those are the groups that you really need to support. The big businesses, although I mean, you know, I don't want to make them have pain, but they can navigate these things. It's the small companies that will just be destroyed.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Debbie. And this is a point that a number of our participants are raising. Again, you know, this concern, does this benefit only big companies? But I think, John, and you have made a very sort of, I think, compelling case about the impact of some of these barriers on small business. So, Simon, I want to bring you in now as well.
Sorry, Anabel.
Yes,
Anabel,
yes.
if I could just offer one observation. I'm paying attention to the Q&A and the comments, et cetera. There is, in some of them, the sense that, oh, whether it's a digital trade agreement or a data and technology forum, this is all about global multinationals setting the rules to benefit themselves only. Let's pause for a moment and think of two of the principal challenges of our time. One, pandemic response and preparedness and getting ready for the next one, and climate change. Both of those problems are going, the response to those problems is going to be technology and data set intensive. So if we want to ensure that we are able to address fundamental existential challenges and bring the power of technology and data analytics to bear, we need to set rules of the road, we need to avoid fragmentation, and we need to establish principles and mechanisms so that we derive the benefits from the digital economy, including those on those existential problems. So the suggestion or implication that, oh, this is all about big business or oligopolists is, to me, fundamentally wrong-headed.
So thank you very much. So let me maybe I want to bring you in, Simon, by asking you a question, because there's concern about, you know, is it big business, small business, but there's also, as I mentioned, across countries, advanced countries, developing countries. So we know that, you know, to maximize the gains from digitization, many developing countries need to bridge the digital divide and to strengthen their capacities to leverage digital technologies, for sure. What do you think is the role for trade policy in particular in supporting increased participation of firms from developing countries in the digital commerce?
So I think this is a really important question which has to be handled on two tracks. I mean, there is a trade policy track which I'll come to, but we must not forget, you know, all of these important statements about the need for appropriate flanking policies in infrastructure, education, and the like, which provide overall populations with the resources and the tools they need to take advantage of the amazing opportunities which are created by digital technology. So we must never forget that. Where does trade come in? I mean, I think you've heard very eloquently from John and from Debbie all of the many different ways in which trade policy can either deliberately or inadvertently create barriers and uncertainty. And we know very much from research that those barriers have the sharpest, the biggest effects on small and medium-sized enterprises. They do not have the time and the resources to be able to invest in being able to figure out how to align with different regulations. And then add on top of what I showed you earlier. Here, it's not just that there's a set of regulations in place. We have dozens of regulatory developments every month now. So how on earth can people small and medium-sized businesses stay on top of that. So that really points to the need for some type of international mechanisms which help provide for some degree of stability and certainty, some degree of transparency. And in this way, we help sort of level the playing field a little bit. I mean, I'm very much of the view that by and large, rules not only help with transparency, but also empower the poorest. The strongest don't need the rules. It's the weakest who need the rules. In this case, in this context, this is an area where I think the SMEs benefit enormously. So the whole, the classic trade policy agenda, which we're seeing developing, a number of the initiatives in the regional trading agreements space are, I mean, very creative in terms of what we're seeing. Countries like Singapore, New Zealand, Chile, the US, the UK, Japan doing as well. But these are, I think, this is a very interesting and innovative space, and we need to keep building on that and directing those initiatives, and always keeping in mind how does this affect a small and medium-sized enterprise. That's got to be an important consideration.
Thank you very much, Simon. So then you were advocating for the U.S. To take a leadership in this area and engage in digital trade negotiations. What role do you think, more broadly, if if we look at it from a G20 perspective, what role do you think the G20 can play in terms of shaping the trade policy discussion for the digital economy? We know a lot of that has been happening, but what more can you think the G20 could do in this space?
It's a great question, Anabel. As I've suggested, I think at least initially, the G7 needs to come to some fundamental understandings among itself on key questions regarding the digital economy. This is not to say that this is exclusive. This is not to say that whatever those understandings are to be imposed on the G20, but we have disagreements even among G7 countries. We have disagreements in the transatlantic space between the EU and the United States on certain issues. We're moving closer. We're moving closer. Our public opinions are moving closer, and the attitudes of our companies are moving closer. Yet there is still friction even there, right? We hear coming from Brussels talk of digital sovereignty, which kind of smacks of digital self-sufficiency to a certain extent. But on the US side, I think there is a growing recognition of the need for greater regulation, of the importance of getting privacy right, and the importance of regulating in a sensible way online platforms. So, number one, among developed countries, I think we've got to work out our differences. But that isn't alone. And the G20 is going to be a critical forum for reaching understanding among those with whom, at least at present, there are fundamental disagreements, such as much of the developed and developing world, and China in terms of technology, the use of technology. Is technology too often a tool of political repression? How do we use biometric technologies? I mean, we've all read the stories. So I think the G20 will play and must play a critical role in, again, coming up with rules of the road with do's and don'ts. But neither the G20 nor the G7 are global legislators, right? They can agree principles, and then it's up to each country to implement those agreed principles faithfully. For example, China participates in the Financial Stability Board. Russia participates in the Financial Stability Board. Do its financial regulatory regimes fully and faithfully implement all of the principles agreed by the Financial Stability Board? I think the fair answer is they do not. So there are challenges with having a broader base forum, but I think those challenges are dwarfed by the benefits of having that diversity of views at the table, even having members at the table with whom there are fundamental disagreements. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan. And I think this is a nice segue into the topic of the WTO negotiations in this area. So I'd like to ask each of you to comment on those negotiations. And in particular, we have a couple of questions from the audience. One is from an anonymous attendee that basically says, so if we have chapters in FTA, why should we join plurilateral negotiation in the WTO? What is the benefit of doing that? We also have a question from Pierre Sauvé saying, well, if we look of hortatory language in this chapters or in this agreement. So, what can we expect in terms of the likely scope of the WTO hard law outcome of the negotiations in this area? So, and more broadly, what needs to be done and what can be expected to achieve significant progress on e-commerce by the next ministerial conference in the WTO. And I think this will probably be the last intervention of each of you. So if you'd like to add something more, please do so. And let me maybe start with Debbie here, and then I will go to John, to Dan, and I will conclude with Simon. So Debbie, please.
Great. Thanks so much. I think it's a great set of questions. I think we have to remember that digital started with the promise that anyone, anywhere could become a global multinational. Like you sitting in your living room could create some product or service that could go global. And there's no geographic borders really in the digital space, which is where at the beginning of this, it was fantastic, lots of opportunities, but there were also risks attached to that. So you can see how governments increasingly said, wait a minute, we can't have a completely unregulated space. Businesses themselves actually don't like unregulated spaces either, because the risk is high and the uncertainty is high that at any moment that might change. So increasingly, we've got this growing momentum for having greater certainty, lower the risk, have some consistency, have some regulations and rules that are common, particularly for digital, which means by definition, it needs to be as global as possible, because that's how you get the real benefits from this. But it doesn't mean, and I think I should just make this last point, it doesn't mean that everything related to digital requires regulating, or that everything requires rules or legislation or whatever. Some of those conversations are not yet ripe for inputting into various kinds of negotiations. They really should stay at a cooperative level until we've decided what is the problem, what are we going to do about it, what is the challenge we're trying to address, what are the possible ways to get at that. So not everything needs to be regulated, but where we have identified challenges, the more global those and consistent those rules are, the better for everyone. And again, crucially, the best for the smaller businesses who need that global platform in order to survive and thrive in a post-COVID world.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Debbie. John, your thoughts?
Oh, look, thanks so much. I just want to pick up on something that Dan said. Another area, I think, which is a regional grouping, which I think is really important to look at in advancing the discussion on digital, is actually the Asia Pacific Economic Community, APEC. I used to chair finance and economics in ABAC, and that was basically the basis for my interventions in terms of the B20, et cetera, because that's when business leaders collectively were able to actually get direct lines into the leadership. One of the things that's always attractive about APEC is it's always, people criticize because it's voluntary, but actually, oddly, it's its strength. The other thing, it brings together China and Russia into the discussion in a relatively acceptable manner, because of the way in which there's no clear leader in a way. And APEC does have a habit of actually developing frameworks which are actually very effective. Look at the whole supply chain revolution, which underpins, in many respects, the APEC economic growth that we've seen. That came about voluntary, through encouragement, through modeling, et cetera. So I think moving forward, Dan, one of the areas, particularly in terms of digital cooperation, we should look at APEC look at the APEC leaders meeting, and in fact, look at the New Zealand leadership next year as an area where I think there's real openness. And the other point I would make is that with Europe at the moment, and particularly the leadership going to the G20 question before of Draghi, Draghi has announced that he will be using effectively the bulk of the European facilitation funds available to him to upgrade the digitization of the Italian economy. Why is that? Partly because it needs it, but the other is if you look at the dominant economic grouping in Italy, it's SMEs. The digitization of SMEs will help them. With regard to the MC12, just picking up that discussion, we're in a lot of contact with ministerial groupings getting ready for MC12, and we're pushing for it. We will pull together the business voice for the MC12 meeting as well. We don't think there'll be a final agreement. We think that's overly ambitious, but we're pretty reliably told there's something like 10 articles will be agreed upon by then. What we don't want is for this to be kicked down the road again to MC13, whenever that might be. What we like is that the principal coordinators of discussions around this project are actually talking about, recognize they won't get there at MC12, but they're still pushing for as soon as practicable. But we're not interested in as soon as practicable if it's going to be a low quality deal. We want what is right and effective, and we want that as soon as possible, but we want a high level deal coming out of it as well. And look, thanks very much, Anabel, again, for having me participate in this discussion today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John, for your remarks. Dan, let me turn it over to you now.
Okay, I'll be very quick. We have 4 minutes to go. Anabel, and this is something I encourage you to consider in your new role, whether it's e-commerce or environmental goods. I do not think we will be able to make significant progress unless we revisit the MFN principle. We need to broaden exceptions to MFN to permit those who would like to go farther, and eliminate the free rider problem. The LDCs, fine, by all means, let them come along. But let us address, through broader exemptions from MFN, the false equivalence that is often asserted between LDCs and the very large developing countries, and we know who we're talking about. If we are to revitalize the negotiating function of the WTO, we've got to address this MFN issue.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your suggestion. Dan, Simon, over to you.
So my understanding is that of the 10 chapters being negotiated with the JSI, 3 are pretty much finalized in the areas of spam, e-signatures, and e-authentication. The tough nuts of both the data localization rules, digital market access, these nuts have yet to be cracked. And it seems that there's serious differences in levels of ambition. And to build on what Dan is saying, maybe we need to think of a conditional MFN solution here rather than a full MFN solution. So I think it is crunch time for the JSI. I suppose as we get closer to MC12, there will be talk about whether we should have an early harvest and lock in at least the 3 chapters and maybe a bit more. But I think these are very practical considerations going down the road. I think the deeper question here, which we will be confronted with, is to what extent are governments really willing to use trade agreements to essentially shape the digital economy, or are alternative mechanisms ones where you have much more dialogue between regulators of the type we've been talking about today? Is that the track which we're going to go? So this will be a very big year for digital trade. And I think we'll learn a hell of a lot about what government's real preferences are as we home in on these tougher negotiating nuts to crack. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. That's actually a great question, which would take a whole episode of Trade Winds to discuss. So let me once again thank our speakers, Simon Evenet, John Denton, Deborah Elms, and Daniel Price for a great conversation on the Digital Policy Alert and the way forward for digital trade negotiations. Thank you also to my Peterson colleagues for their continued support for Trade Winds. And to our audience, many thanks as usual. And please join us in our next episode of Trade. I will direct the World Bank how to leverage trade for growth and development in the post-pandemic world. Until then, thank you all very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.